Hi guys, and welcome to Bedtime History Relaxing. Tonight we step softly into the early hours of a medieval city, where stone streets still hold the chill of night, and the sky above is only just beginning to loosen its grip on darkness. You are already awake before the world fully agrees to be awake, standing somewhere between Siljarmi and the first distant sounds of life returning. There is a strange stillness in this moment, the kind that feels almost like the city is holding its breath before the long effort of the day begins. You probably will not survive this level of exhaustion and uncertainty if you had to live it for real. But tonight you only have to drift through it, gently and safely. The air is cold enough to make your fingers stiff as you adjust the small bundle of goods you plan to sell. Around you, narrow streets are made of uneven stone, worn down by the generations of footsteps, cartwheels, and the slow grinding rhythm of medieval life. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval towns relied heavily on informal street vending because permanent shops were limited and expensive, meaning much of daily commerce happened outdoors in open-air markets that shifted with the seasons and local festivals. You are part of that living system now, not as a merchant with the stall, but as someone who carries their entire livelihood in their arms and on their back. You move carefully, listening to the faint sounds of early morning. Somewhere far off, a bell rings from a church tower, not yet calling for full worship, but signalling that the city is beginning to remember itself. Doors creak open, a dog barks once, then falls silent again. Smoke begins to rise from chimneys in thin, lazy streams, carrying the scent of burning wood and yesterday's ashes. You tighten your grip on your bundle, feeling the rough fabric bite into your palm. Your goods are simple: a little bread wrapped in cloth, a few small herbs gathered or traded for, maybe a handful of trinkets carved from wood or bone. Nothing luxurious, nothing stole. Just enough to hope that someone will exchange coins for them before the day ends. Each item feels heavier than it should, not because of physical weight, but because of what it represents. If they do not sell, you do not eat. As you walk, your footsteps echo faintly between stone walls. The medieval street vendor life is often imagined as colourful and lively, but in reality it begins in quiet loneliness like this, where even your own breathing feels louder than the world around you. There is a quirky tidbit from some archaeological findings in old European towns suggesting that vendors sometimes mark their preferred standing spots with scratches or small carvings on stone or wood, almost like silent ownership of invisible territories. You imagine yourself doing the same, claiming a corner of the world not with words, but with repetition and presence. You pass closed shutters and sleeping buildings. A bakery has not yet opened its doors, but you can already smell flour and yeast waiting behind thick wooden walls. You think about how many hands will soon move through that space, shaping bread that might sell more easily than anything you carry. Your stomach reminds you of its emptiness in a quiet, persistent way. You keep walking toward the market square. The ground changes slightly as you move, becoming more worn, more familiar, as if hundreds of years of trade have polished it into a shared memory. This is where you will try to survive the day. Historians still argue whether medieval street vendors operated mostly as independent entrepreneurs, or whether they were loosely controlled by guild systems that extended their influence even into informal trade. What is clear, however, is that regulation and survival were always intertwined, even for those who seem to operate freely in the open air. You arrive early, before the main crowd. The square is not yet alive, but it is not empty either. Other vendors are already there, each one occupying their chosen space like small islands in a growing sea of commerce. You recognize some of them by sight alone, faces that have become part of your daily reality without ever becoming close friends. A woman nearby adjusts baskets of vegetables, her movements quick and practiced. A man leans against a cart filled with simple tools, watching everything with tired eyes. No one speaks much yet. There is an unspoken understanding that morning is for preparation, not conversation. You choose your spot carefully. Too close to the centre and you might be pushed aside by louder competition. Too far and you may disappear from attention entirely. You settle somewhere in between, placing your bundle down and exhaling slowly. This is your position for the day, fragile and temporary, but yours for now. The sky is slowly brightening. Light begins to stretch across rooftops, turning grey stone into soft shades of gold and pale amber. The city is waking more fully now. You hear footsteps approaching, the first potential customers of the day. Your posture changes instinctively. You straighten slightly, readying yourself for the performance of selling. This is where the real work begins. Not the walking, not the carrying, but the constant awareness of others. Every glance becomes a possible transaction. Every pause in someone's step becomes an opportunity or a loss. You feel the weight of the day ahead, but also the strange rhythm of it. Medieval street vending is not structured like modern retail. There is no schedule, no guaranteed flow of customers. Everything depends on chance, timing, and how well you can read a stranger's intentions in a single second of eye contact. A few early buyers drift into the square. You watch them carefully. Their clothing suggests modest means, perhaps labourers or servants sent to fetch supplies. You prepare your first words of the day, keeping your voice calm, measured, inviting without being desperate. The air is still cold enough that your breath appears faintly in front of you, dissolving quickly into the morning light. You think briefly about how fragile this entire system is. One good day means stability, one bad day means uncertainty. There is no buffer between them, and yet despite everything there is movement. Life continues to flow through the square. Coins will change hands, goods will be exchanged, people will argue, laugh, hesitate, decide. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Invite viewers to post their location and local time. Now, dim the lights. You begin your first exchange of the day, leaning slightly forward as a passerby slows near your goods. Their eyes flick a bit down, then up again, weighing value without speaking. You offer a simple greeting, careful not to overwhelm them. The negotiation is subtle, almost squalent, like a dance where neither participant fully admits they are dancing. Coins eventually change hands. They are uneven, slightly worn, but accepted. You tuck them away carefully, feeling the small but real relief of the first sale. It is never much, never enough, but it is something. As the square continues to fill, you become part of its rhythm. Voices rise gradually, bargaining begins to overlap. The sound of trade grows like a tide. Somewhere behind it all, the city fully wakes, and you remain standing within it, one vendor among many, carrying your small world through another uncertain day. The first coin sits heavier in your pocket than its weight suggests, as if it carries the proof that the day has officially begun for you, around you. The market square continues to awaken in uneven waves. Some vendors are now fully alert, calling out softly to passing figures, while others still adjust their goods with the slow caution of people who know the morning can turn either profitable or empty without warning. You shift your bundle slightly, reorganizing what little you have left to sell. Bread wrapped in cloth is checked first. You press it gently, making sure it has not been crushed during your walk. Herbs are next. Their scent faint but still present when you bring them close to your face. The small trinkets remain untouched, but you arrange them anyway, placing them where the early light might catch on their carved edges. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval towns enforce strict rules on weights and measures, often appointing officials to inspect market goods to prevent fraud. Even small street vendors like you are expected to follow these standards. Though enforcement could be inconsistent depending on the town of the day, and the mood of authority present. This meant that every sale carried an invisible layer of risk beyond simple bargaining. You were not just convincing a customer, you were also navigating a system that could question whether your portion of bread or herbs was truly honest. A few more people drift into the square. Their footsteps are slower now, more purposeful. The early hesitation of morning is fading, replaced by the practical urgency of daily life. You notice how sound begins to build, not loud yet, but layered. A woman calling out prices from a nearby stall. The clatter of wooden crates being set down. The soft rustle of fabric as goods are uncovered and displayed. You begin your second attempt at selling. A passerby glances at your bread but does not stop. Another looks briefly at your herbs, then continues walking. Each moment of attention feels like a small spark that either fades or catches. You're learning, as you do every day, how fragile attention really is. Nearby, another vendor leans closer to you and mutters a quick observation about the crowd. It is not friendship exactly, but it is not hostility either. In medieval markets, proximity often created a quiet network of awareness. You share information about demand, about which goods are moving, about which corners of the square are being avoided today. You respond with a nod, careful not to lose focus on your own space. A quirky tidbit from some historical accounts suggests that certain vendors use distinctive verbal cries or rhythmic phrases to attract attention, almost like personal signatures that regular customers would recognize over time. These calls were not standardized, and some towns even attempted to regulate them, fearing that excessive noise would disrupt order or mislead buyers. You imagine what your own voice might sound like if shaped into such a pattern, something repeated so often it becomes part of the square itself. The sun climbs a little higher, and with it, the square becomes more defined, shadows shorten, colours sharpen, the stone beneath your feet warms slightly. You adjust your stance, shifting weight from one leg to the other, trying to prevent the early stiffness from turning into deeper fatigue. Another customer approaches. This one pauses longer, studying your goods with more intent. You offer a simple greeting again, keeping your tone steady. There is always a balance to maintain. Too eager and you appear desperate, too quiet and you disappear entirely. They pick up one of your herbs, turning it slowly between their fingers. You watch their expression carefully, trying to read whether interest is real or polite. A small negotiation begins, not spoken all at once, but unfolding in fragments. A question about price, a hesitation, a counter-suggestion. You respond carefully, adjusting slightly, but not too much. Every coin matters. Eventually they agree. Another exchange completes. The second sale of your day feels less dramatic than the first, but more important in a quieter way. It confirms that the market is functioning beyond chance. You're not entirely dependent on luck yet. As they walk away, you glance briefly at the growing crowd. The square is now fully active. You can hear overlapping conversations, the rhythmic calls of vendors, and the occasional sharp laughter cutting through the noise, somewhere behind it all. A bell rings again, marking time in a way few people consciously acknowledge, but everyone feels. Historians still argue whether medieval street vending was primarily a survival strategy for the poorest urban residents, or whether it also served as an entry point into more structured trade networks. The records are incomplete, but the pattern suggests both possibilities may have coexisted depending on location and era. You notice a small group gathering near a stall that sells cloth. Movement there draws attention away from your corner. You feel the subtle pressure of competition without anyone directly confronting you. This is how most rivalry exists here. Not through conflict, but through shifting visibility. You adjust your goods again, trying to make them more noticeable. A slight repositioning of bread, herbs placed closer to the edge of your small display area. You are learning that survival here is partly about presentation, even if the concept feels modern in your mind. Another vendor nearby sighs loudly. Frustrated by slow sales, you do not respond, but you understand the feeling. Every cellar in the square is measuring the same invisible clock. The day will eventually tilt either towards success or toward return with unsold goods. You take a small moment to breathe and observe. Faces pass in every direction. Some are focused, some distracted, some openly tired. A few children weave between adults, pointing at objects they cannot afford but still find fascinating. The square is not just a place of trade, but a place of constant motion, like a living organism that feeds on attention and exchange. A man pauses near you, glancing at your trinkets. He does not speak immediately. You wait, allowing silence to do part of the work. Finally, he asks a question about the origin of one of them. You answer honestly, keeping it simple. In your world, embellishment can sometimes backfire. People here have long memories for disappointment. He does not buy anything, but he lingers for a moment longer before moving on. Not every interaction leads to profit, but each one shapes the rhythm of your day. The light continues to strengthen, and with it, your awareness of fatigue begins to settle deeper into your body. The morning energy that carried you earlier is thinning out, replaced by the steady effort of endurance. You shift your stance again, rolling your shoulders slightly to ease the tension building there. A distant shout rises from another part of the square, followed by a brief laughter. Something has been sold in bulk nearby. You cannot see it clearly or what, but you feel the ripple of attention shift in that direction. Moments like this remind you that you are part of a larger system, one where success is often visible but unevenly distributed. You glance down at your remaining goods, fewer than before, but not yet dangerously low. There is still time in the day, still space for more chances. The market continues to breathe around you, expanding and contracting with every interaction. You remain inside it, steady for now, adjusting as needed, learning the subtle language of survival one exchange at a time. The market behind you is already louder now, but you are no longer fully anchored to it. You have begun the part of the day that belongs to movement, to adjustment, to the constant balancing act between what you carry and what you hope to still sell later. You gather your remaining goods carefully, wrapping them in cloth again, making sure nothing shifts too much as you prepare to move through the streets. You step away from your first position in the square, feeling an immediate change in how the ground responds under your feet. The stone beneath you is uneven, worn down by countless years of carts, boots, and slow weathering. Each step requires attention, not dramatic effort, but constant awareness. Your body learns quickly that nothing here allows you to move without thinking. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval towns developed organically over centuries rather than being designed with strict planning, which meant streets often followed old paths, property lines, and natural terrain. As a result, walking through them was rarely straightforward. You feel this truth with every step as the ground rises and dips in subtle ways, forcing your balance to adjust again and again. The weight you carry is not heavy in a single overwhelming sense. Instead, it is distributed in small burdens: the bundle in your arms, the tension in your shoulders, the awareness of coins already earned, and coins not yet earned. Even your thoughts feel slightly weighted, as if every decision has added a small invisible layer of responsibility. You pass between buildings that lean slightly toward each other, their upper levels closer than their bases. Light filters down in thin strips, creating shifting patterns across the path. Somewhere above, you hear the faint creak of wood as someone opens a shutter. A small amount of dust drifts into the air, visible only when it catches the light. A quirky tidbit from historical reconstruction studies suggests that some medieval streets were so frequently reshaped by repairs and gradual building changes that residents could recognize different eras of paving beneath their feet, almost like walking across layers of time compressed into stone. You imagine this as you walk, wondering how many generations of footsteps are still present in the surface beneath you. Your route is not fixed. You adjust constantly, choosing passages based on movement, light, and instinct. There is no map in your hands, only memory and repetition. You are learning the city through your body rather than through instruction. Every turn feels both familiar and slightly uncertain at the same time. You pass a narrow section where the street slopes gently downward. Your pace slows without conscious decision. The weight you carry shifts forward slightly, pulling at your arms. You correct your posture, careful not to let momentum build too quickly. A slip here would not be dramatic, but it would be costly. You hear distant voices echoing from another alley. Though you cannot see the speakers, sound behaves strangely in these spaces. Bending around walls and corners, sometimes it feels like the city is speaking in fragments rather than full sentences. Historians still argue whether medieval urban movement patterns were primarily guided by economic necessity, or whether social customs and informal neighbourhood boundaries played an equally strong role in determining how people navigated daily space. What is clear is that movement was never random. Even wandering had structure, shaped by habit, familiarity, and survival needs. You adjust your grip again. Your fingers are beginning to feel the strain, not sharp pain, but a steady reminder of continuous use. There is no pause in carrying goods like this. Even when you stand still, you are still holding something that represents your entire ability to exist here. You pass a small opening where sunlight pours in more strongly. For a brief moment, the warmth feels comforting against your skin. Then you move back into shadow again, and the temperature drops slightly, and these shifts happen constantly, and your body responds without complaint, only adaptation. A group of workers passes you in the opposite direction, their boots heavier, their pace more synchronized. They do not look at you directly, but their presence briefly changes the flow of the street. You step slightly to the side to let them pass. This kind of quiet negotiation of space is constant. No one announces it. Everyone understands it. You continue forward, now entering a slightly wider stretch of street. Here, movement becomes easier but also more exposed. There is less protection from walls, fewer corners to retreat into. You feel more visible, even without an audience. A faint smell of baking bread drifts toward you again, reminding you of your earlier thoughts in the square. Hunger returns in a softer but persistent way, not urgent yet, but present enough to influence your awareness. You adjust your thoughts away from it, focusing instead on your destination. A distant bell rings again, marking another shift in the city day. You do not count the hours precisely, but your body understands them anyway. Time here is not divided into neat segments. It is experienced through changes in light, crowd density, and fatigue. A small child runs briefly across your path, chased by an older voice calling from somewhere unseen. You pause slightly to avoid collision, then continue. Moments like this are common, brief interruptions in the flow of movement that remind you how many lives overlap within the same narrow space. A quirky tidbit from some archaeological urban studies notes that wear patterns on ancient street stones often reveal preferred walking routes that do not always match the official main roads recorded in historical documents. People consistently chose paths that made sense to their daily routines rather than formal designations. You are doing the same without thinking about it, following instinct rather than instruction. Your arms begin to feel heavier now, not dramatically, but noticeably. The repetition of carrying, adjusting, and walking builds slowly, accumulating in muscles and joints. You shift your posture again, trying to distribute the weight more evenly. A cart passes nearby, its wheels producing a deep, uneven rhythm against the stone. The sound lingers even after it moves away. You watch it briefly, noticing how much easier its movement is compared to yours, despite the roughness of the path. Yet you also know the cost. A cart requires ownership, resources, and stability that you do not have. You continue onward, entering a narrower passage again. The walls here are closer, and the air feels slightly cooler. You slow instinctively, careful not to brush too hard against either side. The goods you carry are still intact, but you check them briefly anyway. A habit formed through repetition. You begin to think less about destination and more about rhythm. Step, pause, adjust, continue. The city becomes less like a place and more like a sequence of actions that you must continuously respond to. A distant shout rises, then fades. You do not turn toward it. Not every sound requires attention. You are learning what to ignore as much as what to notice. As you move deeper into the street network, the market feels farther away. Though it is still close in physical terms, this separation is more mental than spatial. You are in transition, suspended between selling and preparing to sell again. The weight in your arms remains steady. The path ahead remains uncertain. Yet you continue forward, not quickly, not slowly, but at the pace that your body allows without protest. You step out of the narrower street and the sound of the city shifts again, like a fabric being turned over. The market square is still behind you in a loose sense, but its presence lingers in echoes of noise and memory. Ahead, the morning world opens into a different rhythm, less concentrated, more scattered, where individual lives pass each other without always colliding. Your arms feel lighter now that you're moving away from the busiest area, but your mind does not relax. In fact, distance from the crowd introduces a different kind of tension. Out here, there is no immediate rush of buyers to distract you, only the steady uncertainty of whether the next place will be better or worse than the last. You adjust your bundle again, more out of habit than necessity. The cloth is beginning to warm slightly from your grip. The smell of herbs still faintly clings to your fingers. Bread is stable for the now, but you are aware that time is always working against anything perishable. A well-established historical observation is that medieval urban economies often depended on overlapping layers of formal and informal exchange, where street vendors like you operated alongside guild members, travelling traders, and household barter systems. Nothing here is isolated. Everything connects in a loose web of necessity. You are not outside the system. You are part of its most flexible edge. You walk past a stone wall where moss grows in uneven patches, dark green against pale grey. Water trickles somewhere nearby, though you cannot see its source. The sound is subtle, almost hidden beneath the distant life of the city, but it adds a softness to the air that briefly eases your fatigue. A group of early travellers passes you. Their clothing suggests they have come from outside the town. Their speech is slightly different in tone, unfamiliar accents blending with local rhythm. You notice how they look around with a mixture of curiosity and calculation, as if trying to understand how this place works without fully stepping into it. You keep walking, maintaining your steady pace. The weight in your arms shifts slightly with each step. It is not just physical burden, it is the awareness that everything you carry represents time already spent and time not yet earned. A curious archival detail from certain regional records suggests that street vendors sometimes developed informal signalling habits, such as placing objects in specific arrangements to indicate availability or pricing changes without needing to constantly speak to passers-by. You imagine how silence itself can become a form of communication in a place like this, where voices compete for attention. The street begins to slope gently upward. You feel it in your calves almost immediately. The incline is not dramatic, but it changes your rhythm. Each step requires slightly more effort. You slow without consciously deciding to do so. Walls on either side become more irregular. Some sections are repaired with newer stone. Others show deep grooves worn by time and weather. The city does not feel unified. It feels assembled, layer by layer, as if no single moment ever fully replaced what came before. You pass a doorway where someone is already awake inside. You can see faint movement through a crack in the wood. The smell of smoke and early cooking drifts out, mixing with cooler air outside. For a moment, you imagine what it would feel like to belong to a space that does not move with you throughout the day. A marketplace scholar perspective often highlights how mobility defined the lives of small traders in medieval towns, forcing them to constantly negotiate space, weather, and social hierarchy just to remain visible. That visibility is what you're chasing now, even in this quieter stretch of road. A horse appears ahead, led by a man walking beside it. You step slightly to the side to give them room. The animal's hooves strike the stone with a heavier sound than human steps, each impact sending a small vibration through the ground. It passes without incident, but it briefly resets the rhythm of your walk. You continue forward, now noticing how the light has changed again. The sun is higher, filtering through rooftops and open gaps between buildings. Shadows shorten and sharpen. The air feels less cold than before, though not yet warm. A small group of children runs across a distant alley opening. Their movement is quick, chaotic, unplanned. You pause only slightly, then continue. Life here moves in layers, and not all layers intersect with your own path directly, even when they share the same space. A lesser-known historical anecdote mentions that some vendors in certain medieval towns developed reputations that lasted years, sometimes even longer than their actual trading presence in a single location, because customers would return seasonally expecting the same voices, the same goods, the same presence. You think about how identity here is less about permanence and more about repetition. You shift your bundle again and noticing that your grip has become slightly more automatic. Earlier in the day, you were aware of every adjustment. Now your body performs them without full attention. This is how routine begins to form, even in unstable conditions. The street widens briefly again, and you take advantage of the space to stretch your shoulders subtly. The tension there is not sharp, but it is constant, like a quiet reminder that you are always carrying more than just physical objects. Far ahead, you hear the faint rise of activity from another smaller gathering place, not as large as the main square, but still active enough to matter. You consider whether to move toward it or continue searching for better positioning elsewhere. Decisions like this are made repeatedly throughout your day, none of them final, all of them important. You pass a section where stone gives way to packed earth. The texture underfoot changes noticeably. Dust rises slightly with each step. You adjust your footing to compensate, careful not to slip or lose balance while carrying your goods. A merchant theory often discussed in historical analysis suggests that medieval street trade operated on a principle of constant micro-negotiation, where every interaction, even non-verbal ones, contributed to a seller's long-term success more than any single transaction. You are experiencing that truth in real time, even if no one ever explained it to you. You glance briefly at your goods again, still intact, still sellable, still your entire day condensed into a small bundle of fragile possibility. The air carries a faint shift in temperature again, suggesting the day is continuing its slow progression toward midday. You can feel the city expanding around you, not physically growing, but becoming more populated, more active, more demanding of attention. You keep walking, not rushing, not hesitating, simply continuing along the uneven thread of streets that connect one uncertain opportunity to another. Each step is part of a longer pattern that you are still learning how to survive within. You begin to notice that the city is no longer in its quiet morning phase. The difference is not sudden, but it is unmistakable. The streets feel fuller, not just with people, but with intention. Every direction now seems to carry someone with a purpose, and you're simply one of many threads moving through the same woven fabric of activity. Your feet adjust to the changing density. You slow slightly when groups pass, then quicken when gaps open. There is no fixed rhythm here, only adaptation. The bundle in your arm shifts again as you resettle it against your side. trying to find a position that will not strain your shoulders too early in the day. A widely accepted historical fact is that medieval towns often experienced peak movement in the hours following the morning church bells, as both religious practice and daily trade aligned unintentionally to create a shared surge of activity. You can feel that effect now, even if no one announces it. The city moves in waves, and you're caught in the rising part of one. You pass a corner where two narrow streets intersect. A man is already standing there selling simple wooden tools. He watches you briefly as you pass, not unfriendly, but assessing. You return the glance for only a moment before continuing. In these spaces, recognition is common, but connection is optional. The air smells different here. Less smoke from early fires, more mixed scents of food, animals, and damp stone. It is a smell that belongs to transition, where preparation has ended, but full consumption has not yet taken over. A small but interesting detail from archaeological interpretations of market towns suggests that certain street corners were repeatedly used by vendors over generations, leaving subtle patterns of wear that indicate long-term informal occupation of space. You do not consciously choose your route based on this idea, but your body seems to follow paths that feel already shaped by others before you. You turn slightly into a broader street. The light opens up again, reflecting off pale stone and worn plaster. Here, you notice more permanent stalls mixed with temporary setups. The difference is visible in structure, stability, and confidence. Your own presence feels lighter, more mobile, less anchored. A few early exchanges are already happening around you. Coins change hands with quick gestures. Goods are lifted, inspected, returned, or accepted. The sound of bargaining has grown into a steady background layer, almost like weather rather than conversation. You pause briefly near an open space, evaluating whether this might be another potential selling point. The instinct is immediate. You scan movement patterns rather than just faces. Where do people slow down? Where do they avoid? Where does attention naturally rest? A historical interpretation often emphasized in economic studies of medieval trade is that small-scale vendors operated with highly responsive decision-making, constantly shifting location based on subtle changes in crowd flow rather than fixed schedules. That flexibility is exactly what you are practicing now, even without formal understanding of it. You do not settle here yet. Something about the flow feels too fast, too unstable for your limited stock. You continue walking, adjusting your direction slightly to follow a stream of slower movement. A group of labourers passes you, their voices overlapping in casual conversation. You catch fragments of talk about work, food, and wages, but nothing you can fully hold on to. They move with shared momentum, unlike your solitary rhythm. You tighten your grip on your bundle again, not because it is slipping, but because it reminds you of your position. Everything you need for survival is contained in what you can physically carry. There is comfort in that limitation, but also pressure. A lesser-known historical anecdote from some town records suggests that street vendors sometimes form temporary clusters during busy hours, creating informal micro-markets that could appear and dissolve within the same day, depending on foot traffic and opportunity. You're beginning to understand why. Movement naturally creates gathering points. Even without planning, you pass a narrow alley where the sound of hammering echoes faintly. Someone is repairing something out of sight. The rhythm is steady and deliberate, contrasting with the irregular flow of the street. For a moment, it feels like the city has multiple tempos playing at once. You adjust your direction again, now slightly drifting toward a more open area where visibility seems higher. You're not rushing, but you are testing space, feeling out where your presence might matter most. The sun has climbed further, and the light now feels more direct. Shadows are shorter, sharper. Heat begins to build slowly against stone surfaces. You notice small changes in your body response. a slight increase in thirst, a deeper awareness of fatigue settling into your shoulders. A group of women passes by carrying baskets. One of them glances briefly at your goods, but continues walking. You do not call out yet. Timing matters more than volume at this stage of the day. A scholarly debate that still appears in historical discussions concerns whether medieval street economies were primarily driven by necessity among lower classes, or whether they also offered opportunities for upward mobility in certain urban environments. The evidence is uneven, but what remains clear is that people like you occupied a space where both survival and possibility coexisted in fragile balance. You step over a shallow dip in the street where water is collected and dried unevenly, leaving faint mineral marks on stone. Your movement remains careful but increasingly automatic. The city is teaching your body its patterns without explanation. A faint bell sound echoes again in the distance. It does not feel like a beginning anymore. It feels like continuation. Time here is not segmented clearly, but experienced as gradual pressure shifts. You find yourself approaching another junction, where movement splits in several directions. You pause slightly longer this time, observing one path leads toward louder activity, another toward quieter residential space, a third toward what appears to be another small trade cluster forming. You choose the middle path, trusting a developing sense of balance rather than certainty. As you move forward, the noise behind you blends into the noise ahead. The city does not reset. It expands and overlaps, and you remain inside it, carrying your goods, your fatigue, and your attention, adjusting constantly to a world that never stops rearranging itself around your steps. You notice the change before you fully see it. The sound shifts first, becoming sharper, more layered, as if the street ahead has decided to speak in multiple voices at once. Then the movement becomes clearer. People are no longer just passing through this area. They are stopping, turning, gathering, and deciding. You slow your pace instinctively. Your bundle shifts slightly as your grip tightens, not from fear but from attention. This is the moment in the day where opportunity either opens or closes depending on how quickly you read the situation. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval market activity was often highly concentrated in designated trading zones within towns, where density of buyers and sellers created predictable peaks in commerce during mid-morning hours. You're stepping into one of those peaks now, where every surface seems to carry motion and intent. The street widens into a more active trading strip. Stalls line both sides, some permanent with wooden frames, others temporary with cloth coverings stretched over poles. You immediately feel the difference in pressure. Here, attention is contested. Every vendor is not just selling goods but competing for visibility in real time. You adjust your position slightly, drifting toward the edge where movement slows just enough for people to notice individual sellers. Your eyes scan faces as they pass. Some glance briefly at your bread and herbs, others look through you entirely, already focused on something louder or more visually striking. A small group of children runs past, laughing, weaving between adults. One nearly bumps into a stall, and a vendor snaps a quick warning. The moment passes instantly, absorbed back into the flow of the crowd. Nothing here lingers long unless it is traded, boom, or purchased. A quirky detail from some reconstructed medieval town studies suggests that certain vendors would position their most visually appealing goods at slightly lower eye level to attract children, who then influenced adult purchasing decisions through repeated pointing and attention. You notice how often small hands gesture in this environment, even when they're not the ones holding coins. You shift your display slightly, bred closer to the front. Herbs arranged to catch light. Trinkets placed where movement of passing bodies might create brief moments of reflection or curiosity. You're not decorating, you're engineering attention. The crowd thickens. You hear overlapping calls from other sellers, each voice trying to maintain clarity without disappearing into noise. Prices are announced, then adjusted, then repeated. The rhythm of selling becomes almost musical, but not harmonious. It is layered and competing. You make your first deliberate call of the day, simple and measured, not loud, but clear. A passerby glances toward you, then continues walking. Another slows slightly, then hesitates. You do not push. You wait. In this environment, forcing attention too quickly often causes it to retreat. A well-known historical observation is that medieval urban markets functioned as both economic centres and social gathering spaces, where trade, news, and informal communication blended together into a single continuous environment. You can feel that blending here, where every conversation seems to overlap with someone else's transaction. A man stops near you. His clothing suggests moderate means, not wealthy, but not struggling at the lowest level either. He looks at your herbs first, then your bread. You greet him calmly, letting silence fill the space after your words. He asks a question about price. You answer. He does not respond immediately. That pause is where everything happens. You've learned this already. The decision is never just about value. It is about timing, mood, and comparison with everything else around him. He buys one small portion of herbs, a modest exchange, but still meaningful. You accept the coins carefully, feeling their weight as confirmation that your positioning is working. As he leaves, you notice how quickly your attention shifts to the next potential buyer. There is no time to rest on a single success. The market does not reward memory, it rewards presence. A historical debate that continues among scholars concerns whether medieval street vendors had any formal apprenticeship systems, or whether most learned entirely through observation and repetition in public spaces. Your experience suggests the latter. Everything you know is built from watching others and correcting yourself in real time. You adjust again, subtly stepping half a pace to the side where light falls more clearly across your goods. Visibility is not static here. It changes with every passing body that blocks or reveals your position. A woman approaches, slows, then continues after a brief glance. You do not call out this time. You are learning restraint as much as action. Not every moment of attention must be chased. Nearby, a vendor raises his voice in a sharper tone, attempting to draw attention from the growing crowd. It works briefly, a few heads turn, then the attention disperses again, pulled in multiple directions at once. You feel the weight of your bundle differently now, not heavier, but more strategic. Every item left represents potential future exchange. Every item sold represents survival already secured. A lesser-known historical note from town accounting records suggests that market authorities sometimes adjusted stall placements based on perceived fairness of trade distribution, though enforcement varied widely and often depended on local politics rather than consistent rules. In practice, this meant that space itself could be negotiated, not just goods. You take a small step forward into a slightly better flow of movement. Immediately, you notice more eyes passing over your goods, not stopping yet, but registering. The sun is higher now. The stone beneath your feet feels warmer. The air carries more dust, more scent, more sound. Everything is amplified, but also less distinct. The market is fully alive. You make another small call, a different tone this time, slightly adjusted after observing others. A passerby pauses, considers, then reaches for one item. You begin the exchange carefully, letting it unfold without haste. Coins change hands again. Not a large amount, but steady. The rhythm is forming. You're not thriving, but you're participating successfully enough to remain in motion. Around you, the market continues to expand in intensity. Voices overlap more frequently. Movement becomes denser. You remain inside it, adjusting constantly, reading patterns that change faster than language can describe. And as you stand there, holding what remains of your goods, you understand something quietly practical. In this place, Survival is not a single decision. It is a continuous negotiation with every passing second. The market has now fully settled into its busiest rhythm, and you can feel it not as a single wave but as overlapping currents. People pass in front of you in layers, some close enough that you can see the texture of their clothing, others further back like shifting silhouettes between stalls. The sound is no longer background, it is the environment itself. You adjust your stance again, subtly shifting your weight to keep your arms from locking. The bundle you carry feels more manageable now, not because it has become lighter, but because you have adapted to it. That adaptation is becoming the defining feature of your day. A widely recognized historical fact is that medieval marketplaces often operated under strict local oversight regarding pricing fairness, especially for staple goods such as bread and basic herbs, since these were essential to urban survival and could easily become points of tension between social groups. You feel that structure around you, even if it's not always visible, like an invisible framework guiding how prices are questioned and accepted. A customer stops near your space, not immediately focused on your goods, but scanning everything in front of them. You wait. This waiting is not passive, it is calculated restraint. You're learning that interruption can sometimes reduce interest more than silence. They pick up a piece of bread, press it lightly, look at it from different angles. You notice their hesitation more than their movement. In this environment, hesitation is a language of its own. You respond with a calm tone, offering a price without urgency. Coins are discussed before they are shown. This is common. Value is often negotiated mentally before it becomes physical. The exchange finally happens. You receive payment, and they move on without ceremony. A subtle but interesting detail from historical urban research suggests that some medieval buyers developed habitual routes through markets, returning to the same vendors not out of loyalty alone, but because repetition reduced uncertainty in daily survival routines. You begin to recognize how important familiarity can be, even in a place that appears chaotic. You reposition slightly again, adjusting your display after the sale. Fewer items remain, but they are now more visible. You're unconsciously optimizing space based on crowd flow, a skill that feels more instinctive than learned. Nearby, a vendor raises their voice in a sharp burst of pricing information. The sound cuts through surrounding noise briefly, then dissolves back into the general hum. You notice how attention behaves like water here, pooling for a moment before dispersing again. Another customer approaches your area. This one does not slow immediately. You observe their trajectory instead of interrupting it. They glance sideways, register your presence, and continue forward. Not every glance becomes a transaction. That is something you are learning to accept without frustration. A regional historical perspective often emphasizes that medieval street economies were deeply sensitive to timing, where small shifts in crowd density could determine whether a vendor experienced surplus or shortage by the end of the day. You're beginning to feel those shifts in real time, like subtle changes in pressure across the square. You take a moment to stretch your fingers slightly inside your sleeves. The repetitive holding of goods has created a dull tension in your joints, nothing severe, but persistent. The body here is always negotiating with the day. A group of 3 people stops nearby, discussing something unrelated to you. Their conversation overlaps with the market noise, making it partially audible but incomplete. You catch fragments, but not meaning. Still, their pause creates a brief opening in the flow of movement. You use it, a simple greeting, a measured offer. One of them looks at your herbs, another glances at your bread. The third seems uninterested but does not interrupt the moment. This shared attention is important. Group decisions often unfold slower than individual ones. Eventually one item is purchased, not a large exchange, but enough to confirm continued movement in your day. You accept payment and reset your position again. A lesser-known archival observation suggests that in some medieval towns, vendors occasionally developed informal pricing patterns that adjusted subtly throughout the day based on crowd density rather than fixed rates. Even when official guidelines existed, you're doing something similar without consciously naming it. Your awareness of the crowd is shaping your behavior continuously. The sun continues to rise higher. Light becomes more direct, shadows shorten and sharpen, making the ground appear more defined but also more exposed. You feel warmth building gradually across your shoulders. You shift slightly to avoid standing too long in direct glare. This movement is small but necessary. Comfort here is not constant, it is measured in increments. A customer brushes past your space without stopping. You do not react outwardly, but you track the movement internally. Every passing body carries potential that either resolves or disappears. A historical interpretation frequently discussed in academic circles highlights that medieval vendors often acted as both economic participants and informal information nodes, exchanging news alongside goods. You hear this happening around you. Snippets of conversation about weather, prices, distant towns, and local events blending into trade. You sell another small portion of herbs. The exchange is quick this time, almost routine. You are becoming more efficient without forcing it. Coins accumulate slowly, not enough for certainty, but enough for continuation. That distinction matters more than it did at the start of the day. A small but vivid anecdotal record from certain town accounts describes vendors recognizing regular customers not by name, but by pattern of approach, posture, or timing of arrival. You begin to notice this phenomenon emerging around you, even within a single day. Someone you saw earlier passes again, briefly glancing at your goods. This time they slew. You prepare without speaking too soon. The decision arrives after a short pause. One purchase follows, small but meaningful. You adjust again, now with fewer items remaining. The space in front of you feels more open, but also more vulnerable. Empty display areas can sometimes reduce attention, so you compensate by arranging what remains more deliberately. The market noise continues to build and shift. You remain within it, neither fully stationary nor fully mobile, but constantly adapting to whatever passes through your immediate field of awareness. And as you continue standing there, exchanging goods for coins, you begin to understand the quiet truth of this place. Nothing here is stable for long, except your ability to keep adjusting. The rhythm of the market begins to feel less like something you enter, and more like something that carries you along. You are no longer thinking in terms of beginning or middle of the day. Instead, you are operating inside a continuous flow where each moment is defined by movement, attention, and the brief pauses between transactions. Your remaining goods feel more exposed now that the bundle has thinned. Cloth no longer wraps tightly around abundance, or it wraps around what is left. You adjust it again, not because it needs fixing, but because it gives your hand something to do between customers. A well-documented historical fact is that medieval towns commonly collected market fees from vendors through designated officials who would circulate during trading hours, ensuring that both permanent stallholders and mobile sellers contributed to municipal revenue. This system created a constant awareness among traders that every position in the market carried not just opportunity, but obligation. You notice a small shift in the crowd as a pair of officials enters the area ahead. Their presence is not dramatic, but it is noticeable. Vendors subtly adjust posture, straighten displays, or pause calls for a moment longer than usual. The market does not stop, but it becomes more attentive. You have seen this before. There is a predictable pattern to it. People who represent authority move through space differently, and everyone else adapts around them without needing instruction. The officials begin their slow movement between stalls, checking placements and occasionally speaking to vendors. You are not their immediate target, but you remain aware of their direction. Your hand briefly touches your coin pouch, confirming its position more out of habit than fear. A subtle but interesting detail from some historical municipal records suggests that enforcement of market fees often varied widely depending on the time of day and perceived economic activity, with busier hours leading to more frequent inspections. You feel that timing pressure now, even if no one explicitly mentions it. A nearby vendor quickly adjusts their goods, perhaps anticipating scrutiny. Another continues selling without interruption, as if ignoring presence itself might reduce attention. You remain steady, neither overreacting nor disengaging. A customer approaches your space during this moment of official movement. You briefly consider waiting, but decide instead to continue normally. The customer looks at your bread, then glances past you toward the officials, then back again. Decision-making here is rarely isolated. Everything competes with everything else. The purchase is made quickly. A small exchange. You accept payment and keep your posture neutral. In this environment, visible anxiety can sometimes attract more attention than calm behavior. The officials move past without stopping at your exact position. You feel a small release of tension you did not fully realize you were holding. The market returns to its previous rhythm almost immediately, as if the interruption was simply absorbed into its structure. A scholarly interpretation often discussed in economic history suggests that medieval marketplaces functioned not only as trade centres, but also as visible expressions of local governance, where authority and commerce existed in constant, overlapping presence rather than separation. You experience that overlap directly as movement resumes around you. You take a moment to reorganize what remains of your goods. The space is noticeably emptier now. Bread is reduced, herbs are fewer. The trinkets remain but feel more isolated on the cloth. You adjust their placement to maintain visual balance. A customer pauses briefly, glancing at your remaining items, but does not engage. You do not call out. Instead, you let them pass, observing how attention behaves when supply becomes visibly limited. A small but vivid historical anecdote from urban records notes that some vendors would deliberately hold back certain items until later in the day, creating perceived scarcity to influence demand. You think about this strategy briefly, but your situation is less controlled. You're not managing abundance, you're managing what is left. The crowd density increases slightly again as more people enter the area. Movement becomes more compressed. You adjust your stance to avoid being blocked from view by passing bodies. A passerby accidentally brushes close to your display. Nothing falls, but you instinctively tighten your grip on the cloth. This kind of near disturbance is common and usually harmless, yet it always demands attention. You sell another small item shortly after. The exchange is simple and quick. Coins feel more familiar in your hand now, but no less important. A regional historical perspective often highlights that medieval urban economies relied heavily on microtransactions at street level, where small, repeated exchanges formed the backbone of daily commerce rather than large singular trades. You are living inside that pattern now, transaction by transaction, moment by moment. The sun continues its slow rise, now reaching a point where it begins to feel steady rather than changing. Light is consistent, and shadows are shorter. The city feels fully awake. You notice your own fatigue more clearly now. Not overwhelming, but steady. It sits in your shoulders and lower arms, reminding you that carrying and standing are continuous efforts here, not occasional ones. A vendor nearby calls out a brief offer, voice rising above surrounding noise. You glance briefly, but do not shift position. Your focus remains on your own small area of opportunity. Another customer approaches. This one looks at your goods longer than most. You wait without speaking immediately. Timing has become a skill you are refining throughout the day. They choose one item. The exchange is completed without negotiation. You accept payment and nod slightly as they leave. A lesser-known archival note from certain towns suggests that vendors often measured successful days not only by total earnings, but by the consistency of small transactions, which provided stability in unpredictable environments. You begin to understand why that matters more than single large exchanges. You adjust your cloth again, smoothing it across the ground. The remaining goods are fewer now, but still present, still potential. The market continues around you without pause. Voices overlap and movement persists. Attention shifts constantly, and you remain within it, adapting quietly, selling gradually, and carrying forward whatever remains of your day one exchange at a time. By now, the market has fully matured into its midday state, and you can feel it in the way people move. There is less hesitation than earlier, less scanning and drifting. Everyone here seems to have a destination, even if that destination is only temporary. The air itself feels denser, filled with overlapping voices, scents, and shifting bodies. You stand in your spot with fewer goods than before, and that changes your presence in subtle ways. You are lighter physically, but more exposed visually. Empty space on your cloth signals something to passing eyes, not failure exactly, but limited selection. You adjust the remaining items again, trying to maintain balance between order and availability. A widely accepted historical fact is that medieval urban centres experienced their highest commercial intensity during midday hours, when both local residents and travelling buyers converged into shared market zones. This concentration created periods of extreme activity where vendors had to compete not just with each other, but with time itself. You feel that intensity now as movement increases around you. The crowd is not chaotic, but layered. Some people move quickly, cutting through gaps. Others slow down, pausing to inspect goods. You learn to read these differences instinctively, adjusting your attention without fully thinking about it. A customer approaches and briefly inspects your bread. You notice their eyes flicker, not just to the item, but to the remaining quantity. Scarcity is always part of the calculation. You speak calmly, offering price without urgency. They hesitate, then continue walking. No transaction. You exhale slowly, not disappointed, just observant. Rejection is part of rhythm here, not interruption. A subtle but interesting detail from historical urban studies suggests that medieval vendors often developed heightened awareness of microfacial expressions, since buyers rarely declared intentions openly and instead communicated through hesitation, gaze direction, and physical pause duration. You're experiencing that kind of reading constantly, even without naming it. A nearby stall begins to draw attention with louder calls. You notice how quickly attention shifts when sound intensity increases. A few potential buyers drift away from your area, pulled toward the louder voice. You do not follow them. Instead, you remain anchored, trusting that the movement will eventually return. The sun is now high enough that shadows shrink tightly beneath people's feet. Stone surfaces reflect more heat upward, and you feel warmth building through your clothing. It is not uncomfortable yet, but it adds another layer to your awareness of endurance. You sell a small portion of herbs soon after. The exchange is simple, almost routine. Coins pass into your hand, and you store them carefully. Each addition feels smaller than it did earlier. In the day, not in value, but in emotional impact. Familiarity changes perception. A scholarly debate that continues among historians concerns whether medieval street economies should be understood primarily as informal survival networks or as highly adaptive micro-capitalist systems operating within constrained urban environments. Your experience does not resolve the debate, but it gives it texture. Nothing here feels purely one thing. A group of people passes close together, briefly blocking your visibility. You wait without reacting. When they move on, your space opens again. You adjust slightly forward, reclaiming attention without force. A quirky tidbit from some reconstructed town studies suggests that certain medieval markets unintentionally created predictable attention zones, where foot traffic naturally slowed due to intersections of sightlines, noise, and spatial narrowing. Vendors who learned these zones could increase visibility without moving much at all. You're beginning to sense these invisible patterns. You shift half a step to your left. Almost immediately, you notice a small increase in glances, not dramatic, but noticeable. The difference between being seen and being ignored here is often measured in small spatial adjustments. Another customer pauses longer than others. You offer greeting at the right moment, not too early, not delayed. They examine your remaining bread. Their hand hovers briefly before making contact. That pause tells you everything about their decision process. They buy one item. You complete the exchange smoothly. Coins feel slightly warmer now from repeated handling throughout the day. A regional historical observation often noted in economic literature is that medieval vendors frequently relied on cumulative small gains rather than large profit margins. Since unpredictability in daily foot traffic made consistency more valuable than peak earnings, you are now fully inside that logic without needing explanation. You rearrange your remaining goods again. Fewer items now create more space between each object. That space itself becomes part of presentation. You are no longer just displaying goods, you're displaying possibility. A vendor nearby laughs briefly at something said by a passerby. The sound is light, but it carries through surrounding noise. You notice how emotional tones ripple across space in this environment, influencing attention in subtle ways. You attempt to quiet a call toward passing movement. It reaches a few people, but only one responds with interest. They look, pause, then move closer. You wait patiently, letting them decide without pressure. The exchange follows shortly after. Another small success, another coin added to your pouch. You begin to feel the cumulative effect of the morning and midday combined. Not exhaustion in a sharp sense, but a steady wearing down of energy reserves. Your posture adjusts slightly to compensate, shoulders lowering just a little between interactions. A lesser-known historical note from certain municipal records suggests that some medieval markets informally developed flow hierarchies where certain areas naturally attracted higher quality goods or higher paying customers due to long-term patterns rather than official designation. You are not in such an area, but you can sense how those patterns might form. The market continues to shift around you. People arrive, pause, leave, goods are exchanged, voices rise and fall. You remain within it, adapting continuously, reading movement as much as speech. And as the sun continues its slow climb overhead, you understand that the rest of your day will not be defined by a single moment of success, but by how well you can keep responding to everything that keeps changing around you. The market has shifted again, almost imperceptibly at first, then all at once in the way that only crowded places can. The earlier sharp focus of mid-morning trade has softened into something more uneven. People are still everywhere, but their energy is less urgent, more wandering, as if the city itself has exhaled. You remain in your position, now more familiar with the weight and shape of your remaining goods. The cloth beneath them feels thinner, less burdened. What once felt like a full day's supply now looks modest, even fragile. You adjust the arrangement again, not because it needs it, but because it keeps your hands busy and your mind alert. A widely recognized point in medieval economic history is that market rhythms were deeply influenced by daily labor cycles, meaning that peaks in buying often followed periods when workers were briefly released from immediate obligations. That shift is noticeable now. The crowd is no longer dominated by early planners, but by those moving between tasks, errands, and passing obligations. You observe a change in how people walk. Earlier, it was purposeful. Now it is intermittent. Some stop suddenly, others drift between stalls without commitment. You learn quickly that this is the different kind of opportunity, less structured, more spontaneous. A customer pauses near your space, looking distracted rather than focused. You wait without interrupting their attention. They glance at your herbs, then away, then back again. That second glance matters more than the first. You notice it immediately. They take one item, a small exchange follows, you accept coins and give a short nod. No words linger after the transaction. They disappear into the crowd almost instantly. You are beginning to recognize how these interactions shape your sense of time. It is no longer measured in hours, but in exchanges. Each sale becomes a small marker in an otherwise fluid day. A subtle detail from historical market reconstructions suggests that vendors often unconsciously adjusted their vocal tone throughout the day, shifting from sharp calls in the morning to softer, more conversational pitches later as fatigue and crowd familiarity increased. You notice this tendency in yourself without consciously deciding to follow it. Your voice is quieter now when you speak, not weaker, just more measured. Energy conservation becomes instinctive rather than planned. Nearby, a performer begins to draw attention. You hear the faint rise of music, simple and rhythmic. The crowd responds immediately. Movement shifts toward the sound, creating a brief vacuum around your area. You do not chase it. You understand that attention here is not fixed. It migrates. A quirky observation from cultural studies of medieval towns notes that entertainment and commerce often overlapped so closely that even minor performances could temporarily reshape economic flow within a single street. You witness this directly as people drift away from buying and toward watching. You use the moment of reduced pressure to adjust your posture. Shoulders roll slightly, hands relax for a brief second before returning to position. Even small pauses like this are valuable. When the attention begins to return, you are ready. A passerby slows near your remaining bread. You offer a simple greeting, timed carefully with their movement. They do not respond immediately, but they do not leave either. That in-between space is where most decisions happen. You remain still, allowing it to unfold naturally. Eventually, they buy one piece, you complete the exchange and store the coin carefully. Another small step forward in a day that is increasingly defined by accumulation rather than momentum. A scholarly debate often found in medieval economic studies concerns whether street markets should be viewed primarily as spontaneous social spaces or as highly structured systems shaped by invisible rules of timing, space, and behavioral expectation. Standing here, you can feel both interpretations existing at once. Nothing is fully random, but nothing is fully controlled either. The crowd thickens again as the performance fades. You notice how quickly attention rebalances. It is almost like watching water return to a channel after being diverted. You shift slightly forward, reclaiming visibility. This is not aggressive movement. It is alignment with flow. You are learning how to exist within motion rather than against it. Another customer approaches. This one is more deliberate. Their gaze is steady, scanning your remaining goods with intent. You greet them without delay. They examine what is left more carefully than others did earlier. Scarcity is now obvious, and it changes the dynamic. Instead of abundance competing for attention, there is selection competing for necessity. They choose an item. You complete the exchange. Coins feel more significant now, not because they are more valuable individually, but because each one represents a larger proportion of what remains. A regional historical note suggests that medieval vendors often measured success not only in total profit but in the rate at which goods were converted into currency throughout the day. Since unsold goods carried risk of loss due to perishability, damage, or theft, you are now experiencing that pressure in real time as your stock decreases. You check your remaining items again. Fewer than before, still enough for continuation, but no longer enough for comfort. A small group passes nearby, talking among themselves. You catch fragments of conversation but not full meaning. Their presence briefly increases surrounding noise, then fades as they move on. You adjust your stance again, trying to remain visible without appearing forced. This balance is delicate. Too passive and you disappear. Too active and you repel attention. A quirky tidbit from archaeological interpretations of market sites suggests that repeated foot traffic over time often created subtle visibility corridors where vendors naturally achieved better exposure without formal positioning strategies. You begin to feel how such invisible pathways might form. You're not just standing in a place, you're participating in a pattern shaped by thousands of similar decisions made by others before you. Another sale follows shortly after, small or quick, uncomplicated. You accept it without hesitation. The sun continues its steady movement overhead, and the light grows slightly harsher. Shadows shorten further. Heat begins to settle more consistently across the street. You remain in place, adapting continuously, selling gradually, and observing the market as it shifts again into its next phase without ever fully stopping. The rhythm of the market begins to loosen as the day moves past its sharpest peak. You notice it not in any single dramatic change, but in the way people movements become less aligned. Earlier, there was a kind of shared urgency. Now, everything feels slightly stunned, as if the city is beginning to tire in different places at different times. You shift your weight from one foot to the other. The bundle you carry is noticeably lighter now, and that should feel like relief, but instead, it feels like exposure. Less stock means fewer chances, and fewer chances mean each passing person matters more than before. A well-established historical fact is that medieval urban markets often experienced a gradual decline in transactional intensity after midday. As household needs were largely met and discretionary spending slowed among working populations. You can feel that decline beginning to form around you, like a softening of pressure in the air. You watch a couple pass by your stall. The woman glances briefly at your remaining bread. The man does not look at all. They continue walking without stopping. You do not call out. You are learning that restraint is as important as effort. A subtle but interesting detail from historical economic reconstruction suggests that vendors often developed intuitive awareness of decision delay, meaning they could sense when a customer was about to buy based on tiny pauses in movement rather than words or gestures. You begin to recognize those micro moments more clearly now. Though they are becoming less frequent as the day slows, you adjust your display again, moving the last items slightly closer together. Scarcity is no longer hidden. It is visible, and that visibility changes how people interpret value. A small group gathers near a different stall further down the street, drawn by louder calling and a slightly more animated exchange. You watch the movement shift in that direction. Attention here is never fixed. It flows like something alive, responding instantly to sound, motion, and novelty. You do not follow. Instead, you remain steady and wait for the flow to return. A quirky observation from anthropological studies of medieval commerce suggests that some street vendors developed highly localized micro-timing strategies, adjusting their sales approach not only by hour but by the subtle emotional state of passing crowds, such as fatigue, curiosity, or distraction. You're now operating entirely within that kind of awareness, even if you never named it. A new customer approaches your space slowly. This one does not scan quickly. They linger at the edge of your area before stepping closer. You greet them with a calm tone, letting them decide their own pace. They examine your herbs first, then your bread. Their hand hovers slightly longer than most. That hesitation is familiar now. You wait without pressing them. They choose one item and complete the purchase. The exchange is quiet, almost understated. You accept the coins and briefly adjust your posture afterward, easing tension from your shoulders. A scholarly perspective often discussed in medieval social history emphasizes that marketplaces were not only economic spaces, but also environments of continuous social reading, where participants constantly interpreted one another's status, intention, and reliability through observation rather than formal communication. You experience that reading process constantly. Even without conscious effort, you notice how your own awareness has sharpened over the course of the day. Earlier, you responded to movement, now you anticipate it. A vendor nearby calls out a reduced price. The sound is less forceful than morning calls, more tired, more practical. A few passers-by respond, but not many. You see how energy affects perception of value. You make a small adjustment in tone when greeting the next person. Softer, more conversational. It feels more appropriate for the current flow of the crowd. A passerby pauses briefly, looks at your remaining goods, then shakes their head and continues. You feel nothing immediate in response. Rejection has become part of the structure of the day, not a disruption within it. A regional historical note suggests that medieval vendors often experienced diminishing returns as the day progressed, requiring them to shift strategies between visibility, pricing, and patience in order to maintain any level of trade activity. You're now fully inside that phase where patience matters more than volume. You reposition slightly again, trying to maintain visibility as the crowd thins and redistributes. The space around you feels less compressed than earlier, but also less protective. More gaps appear between people, and with those gaps comes uncertainty. A group of children passes, moving quickly through the area. One briefly looks at your goods, then is pulled away by another. Their movement creates a momentary ripple in attention that fades almost instantly. You sell another small portion shortly after. The exchange is simple. Coins are fewer than earlier transactions, but still meaningful. Each one feels like confirmation that the day is still active. A lesser-known anecdotal record from some medieval town accounts suggests that vendors sometimes mentally divided their day into phases based on crowd behavior rather than timekeeping, such as arrival period, peak flow, and decline period. You're now clearly in the decline phase, even without needing anyone to tell you. The sun has shifted further and the light now feels more stable, less dynamic. Shadows are shorter and less expressive. The street surface is warmer underfoot, and fatigue begins to settle more firmly into your legs. You roll your shoulders slightly, trying to release stiffness that has built gradually rather than suddenly. Another customer approaches, this one slower, more deliberate. They examine your remaining goods carefully. You greet them and wait. After a longer pause than usual, they select one item. The exchange completes. You receive payment and nod briefly. Around you, the market continues to soften. Noise is still present, but less dense. Movement is still constant, but less coordinated. You remain standing within it, adjusting, observing, and continuing to trade in smaller and smaller moments of opportunity as the day begins its gradual transition toward evening. The market no longer feels like a single unified place. Instead, it feels divided into pockets of activity that flare up briefly and then fade again. You notice these small bursts everywhere, a sudden laugh near a stall, a quick negotiation that ends faster than expected, a brief crowd forming around something unseen, then dispersing. You stand within this shifting pattern, your remaining goods now reduced to only a few items. The cloth beneath them looks almost empty compared to earlier in the day. That emptiness changes how you carry yourself. There is less to protect, but also less to rely on. A widely accepted historical fact is that medieval urban trade was deeply sensitive to daily cycles of labour and domestic activity, meaning that afternoon hours often reflected a transition from necessity-driven purchases to more selective or optional exchanges. You can feel that transition shaping the way people look at your stall now. Fewer urgent buyers, more hesitant glances. You greet a passing customer with a calm tone. They slow slightly, look at your herbs, then continue walking. No pause long enough to create opportunity. You do not react outwardly, internally. You are simply noting the pattern. A subtle but interesting detail from historical market studies suggests that vendors often became highly attuned to approach angles, meaning the direction and speed at which a person entered their visual field could strongly indicate likelihood of purchase. Straight, steady approaches were more promising than wandering or erratic movement. You begin to see these patterns automatically now. A couple passes close by. The woman glances at your remaining bread. The man speaks to her quietly, and they continue on. Their attention does not settle, and you let them go without interruption. The sound of the market has softened slightly, but not disappeared. It now feels more fragmented. Instead of one continuous noise, you hear separate conversations layered at different distances. The effect is almost like listening to multiple lives happening in parallel without coordination. A quirky observation from historical anthropology suggests that some medieval vendors believed certain times of day carried different buyer moods, with midday favouring urgency and afternoon favouring hesitation or reflection. Whether or not this belief was accurate, it influenced how some sellers adjusted tone and positioning. You find yourself doing something similar without thinking about it. You lower your voice slightly when addressing the next passerby. It feels more appropriate for the current atmosphere. They glance at your goods and pause briefly, then move on. The hesitation is there, but it does not resolve into action. You shift your stance again, redistributing weight through your legs. Fatigue is no longer just in your arms, it is spreading through your entire posture. Nothing painful, just persistent. A nearby vendor begins packing away a portion of their goods earlier than expected. You notice this immediately. Early reduction often signals expectation of slow final hours or limited remaining opportunity. Others continue selling, but with less intensity. A scholarly debate in medieval economic history concerns whether afternoon market decline was primarily caused by the reduced demand or by vendor fatigue leading to less effective selling behaviour. The evidence is mixed, but in moments like this, you can feel how both factors might be true at once. Energy affects performance, and performance affects results. You continue adjusting your small display. The remaining items are now sized carefully, each one more visible, but also more exposed. There is no longer abundance to suggest variety, only select presence remains. A customer approaches slowly. This one looks more tired than others, their movement unhurried, their attention divided. You greet them without urgency. They inspect your bread. Their hand rests near it longer than most previous customers. You wait without speaking. The pause stretches slightly. Eventually, they purchase one piece. The exchange is simple and quiet. You accept the coins and store them carefully. A regional historical note suggests that medieval vendors often experienced a psychological shift in late trading hours, where each sale felt more significant not because of value, but because of diminishing opportunity. You're beginning to feel that shift now. Each exchange carries more weight emotionally than numerically. You briefly adjust your cloth again, though there is little left to organize. The act itself feels more like maintaining structure than managing goods. The crowd density continues to thin gradually. More space appears between people. Movements are less synchronized. You can see further down the street now without obstruction. A small group of children runs through you again, briefly breaking the slower rhythm. Their presence creates a short burst of energy, then fades as quickly as you arrived. You sell another small item shortly after. The exchange is efficient, no hesitation on either side. A lesser-known anecdotal source from certain town records describes vendors who would begin mentally calculating closing expectations during late afternoon hours, adjusting their final strategies based on remaining stock and perceived crowd strength. You're now operating in that same mental space, whether you intended to or not. The sun continues its gradual descent, though it is still high enough to keep the street bright. The quality of light, however, feels different, less sharp, slightly warmer in tone. You notice your own fatigue more clearly now. It is not overwhelming, but it is consistent. Your body feels like it is maintaining effort rather than generating it. Another passerby stops briefly, looks at your remaining goods, then continues walking. You do not attempt to call them back. Energy conservation becomes part of strategy at this stage. A quirky detail from reconstructed urban studies suggests that some medieval market layouts unintentionally created natural late-day quiet zones, where trade activity diminished faster due to crowd dispersal patterns and directional flow toward residential areas. You may be approaching one of those zones now, as movement becomes slightly less dense. You remain still for a moment, observing rather than acting. The market is still active, but less responsive than before. Then you adjust again, repositioning slightly to remain within the stream of passing attention, and you continue selling, slowly, steadily, as the afternoon begins its quiet descent toward evening. The market has entered a quieter phase now, not sent, but noticeably softened, as if the entire space has lowered its voice. You feel it in the spacing between people, in the slower drift of footsteps, and in the way conversations no longer overlap as aggressively as before. Each exchange seems more isolated, like individual moments instead of part of a single rhythm. You remain standing in your place with only a small portion of goods left. The cloth beneath them looks almost symbolic now, holding just enough to suggest you're still trading, but not enough to suggest abundance. That shift subtly changes how people perceive you, even if they are not consciously aware of it. A well-documented historical fact is that medieval urban markets typically experienced a second decline in activity during late afternoon hours, as households completed essential purchases earlier in the day, and labour patterns shifted toward return travel or domestic tasks. This created a period where vendors either adapted their strategy or gradually wound down their trade. You notice this transition in the behaviour of passers-by. Fewer people stop, more people pass with intent to leave rather than to explore. The emotional texture of the crowd feels different now, less curious and more conclusive. A customer approaches your stall slowly. Their pace suggests hesitation rather than urgency. You greet them calmly and allow space for decision-making. They glance at your remaining bread, then at your herbs, then back again. You do not interrupt the silence. In this part of the day, silence carries more influence than speech. Eventually, they select a small portion. The exchange is completed without negotiation. You accept the coins and briefly adjust your posture afterward, easing tension that has built up in your lower back. A subtle but interesting detail from historical market behavior studies suggests that vendors often unconsciously reduced their vocal effort as the day progressed, not only due to fatigue but also because lower crowd density made aggressive calling less effective. Instead, timing and proximity became more important than volume. You find yourself doing exactly that. Your calls are fewer, shorter, more deliberate. You wait more than you speak. Nearby, a vendor begins bundling their goods early, stacking items into crates with practiced efficiency. Others continue selling, but with less intensity than earlier. The difference is not dramatic, but it is consistent across the entire area. A quirky observation drawn from ethnographic interpretations of medieval trade spaces suggests that afternoon markets often developed what researchers describe as soft closure behavior, where participants gradually transitioned from active selling to passive waiting before officially ending their day. You can feel that gradual transition forming around you. You shift your goods slightly again, though there is very little left to arrange. Each item now carries more visual weight simply because of its isolation. Empty space has become part of your display. A small group passes by, talking among themselves. You catch fragments of their conversation, something about food preparation and returning home. Their attention does not linger. They are moving out of the market space emotionally before they leave physically. You sell another item shortly after. The exchange is brief. You receive coins and store them carefully. A scholarly debate within medieval economic history concerns whether late-day market slowdown was primarily driven by reduced demand or whether it reflected strategic withdrawal by vendors attempting to avoid low-profit transactions and preserve remaining goods for better opportunities on future days. Both interpretations appear in different regional studies, and neither fully excludes the other. You can feel both ideas at work here. Demand is clearly lower, but so is effort from all sides. You adjust your stance again, shifting weight to relieve fatigue in your legs. The strain is not sharp, but constant. It builds slowly through repetition rather than sudden force. A passerby pauses briefly, looks at your remaining bread, then continues walking without stopping. You do not call out. The energy required for persuasion is now being reserved for more likely opportunities. A lesser-known historical note from certain municipal records suggests that some markets had informal closing accelerations where once a critical mass of vendors began packing up. The entire space would shift rapidly towards shutdown behaviour. While not formally organised, the effect created a visible cascade of reduced activity. You are beginning to sense the early stages of that cascade. Movement is still present, but direction is becoming more uniform. People are orienting outward, away from the market rather than deeper into it. You sell another small portion. The transaction is smooth, almost routine now. Coins feel different in your hand at this stage of the day, not heavier or lighter, but more meaningful because fewer remain to be earned. A quirky tidbit from reconstructed urban studies suggests that some medieval vendors developed end-of-day rituals involving gradual packing rather than sudden closure, both to maintain customer opportunity and to psychologically ease the transition out of trading mode. You begin to naturally follow a similar pattern, organising remaining items as you go rather than waiting for a final moment. The sunlight has shifted again. It is still bright, but no longer intense. Shadows are longer, softer at the edges. The temperature feels slightly cooler against your skin. You notice your fatigue more clearly now. It is not overwhelming, but it is continuous. Every movement requires a small negotiation with tired muscles. Another customer approaches, slower than most. They look at your remaining goods with mild interest. You greet them calmly. After a brief pause, they purchase one item. The exchange is simple and final. A regional historical interpretation often highlights that medieval street vendors in late trading hours relied more on residual foot traffic and chance encounters than on active solicitation. As the market gradually shifted from commerce toward closure, you remain in place for a moment, observing the thinning crowd. The space around you feels more open, but also more uncertain. Opportunity still exists, but it arrives less frequently. You adjust your cloth one more time, gathering remaining items closer together, and you continue waiting, trading, and observing, as the market slowly prepares to end its day without ever fully stopping all at once. The atmosphere around you has softened into something noticeably different now, as if the market is no longer expanding outward, but gently folding back into itself. The energy that once pushed people through the space has weakened, replaced by slower movements and more deliberate exits. You can feel that shift in every direction at once. Your remaining goods are now minimal, arranged carefully on the cloth in front of you. What was once a small display has become something closer to a final offering. Each item feels more significant simply because there are fewer of them left to represent your entire day. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval European markets operated within fixed daily cycles that naturally aligned with daylight hours, meaning that trade intensity was heavily dependent on sun position rather than standardized timekeeping. As daylight declined, so did economic activity, regardless of demand still present in the area. You notice this transition unfolding around you. People are still here, but their intentions are shifting. Instead of browsing, they are completing. Instead of exploring, they are concluding. You can sense closure forming in the way bodies orient themselves toward exits rather than stalls. A customer approaches with slower steps than earlier buyers. Their attention is not rushed. They look at your remaining bread, then pause for a longer moment than usual. You greet them calmly, matching their pace rather than trying to accelerate it. Silence stretches between you and them. In earlier hours, silence felt like hesitation. Now it feels like final consideration. They choose one item. You complete the exchange without urgency. Coins are placed into your hand and you store them carefully. The motion feels familiar now, almost automatic, shaped by repetition across the entire day. A subtle but interesting detail from historical urban research suggests that late afternoon market behaviour often showed increased selectivity among buyers as fewer options remained and decision-making shifted from comparison to necessity. You can feel that logic now in how people approach what is left. A nearby vendor begins packing with visible intent, not rushed, but decisive. Wooden crates are closed. Cloth coverings are folded. The sound of goods being gathered begins to appear more frequently around you. You are still selling, but you are also beginning to think in terms of ending. The two states overlap without clear separation. A quirky observation from anthropological studies of medieval trade spaces suggests that many vendors developed a gradual psychological transition during late trading hours, where attention shifted from attracting customers to managing remaining inventory and preparing for departure. You notice yourself doing exactly that, even without planning it. You adjust your remaining goods again, bringing them closer together. The empty space around them is now dominant. It makes each item feel isolated, almost fragile in its importance. A small group passes nearby, talking quietly among themselves. Their tone is less energetic than earlier in the day. You catch fragments of conversation about returning home and finishing tasks. They do not stop. You remain attentive, but less reactive. At this stage of the day, attention is no longer aggressive, it is selective. A scholarly debate within medieval economic history concerns whether end-of-day market slowdown was primarily caused by reduced buyer demand or whether it was shaped more significantly by coordinated behavioural withdrawal among vendors anticipating diminishing returns. The patterns observed in historical records allow for both interpretations without clear resolution. You can feel both influences at work. Fewer buyers are arriving, and sellers are also reducing effort simultaneously. The system winds down from both sides. You sell another small portion shortly after. The exchange is quick, almost routine. Coins are fewer in number now, but each one feels more final in a different way, as if representing the last remaining opportunities of the days. You roll your shoulders gently, trying to release accumulated tension. Fatigue is no longer just physical. It has become a steady background state, something you carry without resistance. A passerby pauses briefly, looks at your remaining goods, then continues walking without engaging. You do not call out. Energy conservation now feels natural rather than strategic. A lesser-known historical note from certain town records suggests that some medieval markets experienced what could be described as informal synchronization of closure, where once a portion of vendors began packing up, others followed in a gradual chain reaction that reshaped the entire market atmosphere within a short period. You are beginning to see that pattern emerge around you. More stalls are partially packed, more spaces are visibly emptying. Movement is still present, but increasingly directional, pointing away from the trading area. You complete another sale, a small exchange, but still meaningful. The rhythm of coins entering your hand has slowed, but not stopped. The sunlight now carries a warmer tone, softer than midday brightness. Shadows stretch longer across the stone ground, and the market begins to feel less vertical in energy and more horizontal, as if everything is flattening toward conclusion. You adjust your cloth one final time, gathering what remains into a tighter arrangement. There is not much left to organize. A quirky tidbit from reconstructed market studies suggests that vendors often developed a final listening phase during late trading hours, where they relied more on ambient cues such as footsteps slowing or conversations turning toward departure rather than actively calling out to attract customers. You're now fully inside that phase without needing to consciously enter it. You remain still for a moment, observing the thinning crowd. The market is not ending abruptly. It is dissolving gradually, piece by piece, through small decisions made across hundreds of individuals. And as you stand there with only a few remaining items, you continue to wait, adapt, and complete what remains of your trading day as the space around you slowly prepares to quiet itself. The market no longer feels crowded in the way it did earlier. Instead, it feels stretched, as if the same space is now holding fewer people and more silence between them. The remaining movement is steady but unhurried, like a river that has lost some of its strength before reaching the end of its course. You stand beside your remaining goods, which are now reduced to only a few pieces. The cloth beneath them looks almost bare. What remains is not just inventory, but the last portion of your day's opportunity. Each item now carries a kind of finality that earlier sales did not. A well-established historical fact is that many medieval markets operated in close connection with surrounding labour schedules, meaning that as working groups began returning to households or communal spaces, market activity naturally declined in parallel, rather than through any formal closure signal. You can feel that gradual withdrawal happening around you, and people still pass, but fewer of them stop. Those who do are slower, more selective, and less engaged in comparison. You adjust your posture slightly, not in anticipation of heavy sales, but in acknowledgement that effort must now be more deliberate. A customer approaches and briefly examines your remaining bread. They take longer than most earlier buyers, not because of confusion, but because decision-making has slowed across the entire environment. You greet them gently and wait. Silence expands between your words. In earlier hours, silence felt like hesitation waiting to be broken. Now it feels like a shared understanding that every exchange carries closure. They purchase one item. You complete the transaction and receive coins that feel more significant simply because fewer exchanges remain possible. You store them carefully. A subtle but interesting detail from historical market behavior analysis suggests that late-day transactions often involved less negotiation, as both buyers and sellers tended to prioritize completion over optimization. You notice this shift in your own interactions: fewer discussions, faster decisions, less resistance. Nearby, a vendor finishes packing another section of their stall. The sound of folding cloth and closing crates becomes more noticeable than calling voices. The auditory balance of the market is changing. You adjust your remaining goods slightly, though there is little left to reorganize. The act now feels more symbolic than functional. You're maintaining presence rather than arranging abundance. A quirky observation from anthropological interpretations of medieval trade environments suggests that vendors often experienced a psychological transition during late trading hours, where attention shifted from attracting new customers to preserving energy for end-of-day accounting and transport. You're beginning to operate within that same mental frame. A small group of passers-by walks together, speaking quietly. Their conversation is less fragmented than earlier noise, more continuous, but directed away from commerce. You catch fragments about returning home and preparing meals. They do not stop. You sell another small item shortly after. The exchange is brief and efficient. Coins enter your hand and are stored without delay. A scholarly debate in medieval economic history concerns whether late-stage market decline was driven primarily by reduced demand or whether it reflected coordinated behavioral adaptation among participants who collectively reduced engagement as daylight diminished. The reality likely includes both forces working simultaneously, reinforcing each other as the day progresses. You can feel that dual process clearly now. Fewer buyers are present, and those present are less inclined to engage deeply. At the same time, vendors around you are also reducing effort, reinforcing the overall slowdown. You shift your weight slightly to relieve fatigue in your legs. The strain is now steady, not sharp. It sits in your body like a constant reminder of sustained effort. A passerby looks briefly at your remaining goods, then continues walking. You do not call out. At this stage, silence often communicates more appropriately than effort. A lesser-known historical note from certain municipal observations suggests that some markets experienced a cascading end phase where the reduction in activity was not linear, but accelerating, as each vendor's decision to begin packing encouraged others to do the same, gradually transforming the space from active trade zone to dispersal area. You are witnessing that cascade begin more clearly now. More stalls are partially dismantled, More sellers are preparing goods for transport. The visual density of the market is decreasing. You complete another sale, a small exchange, but still part of the continuing rhythm of the day. Each coin now feels like a final addition rather than part of a growing total. The sunlight has shifted again. It is softer now, angled lower, less intense. Shadows are longer and more diffuse across the stone street. The environment feels less compressed, more open, and slightly emptier with each passing moment. You adjust your cloth one last time, gathering the remaining items closer together. There is very little left, and what remains is now clearly defined as end-of-day stock. A quirky tidbit from reconstructed urban studies suggests that late medieval vendors often developed a heightened sensitivity to ambient changes in crowd tone, such as reduced bargaining energy, increased movement toward exits, and the subtle disappearance of exploratory browsing behavior. You're fully immersed in that sensory awareness now without needing to analyze it. You remain standing, observing the thinning flow of people. The market is not collapsing. It is resolving slowly and naturally into something quieter, and as you continue to wait for the final few exchanges of the day, you understand that what remains is no longer about building profit, but about closing the cycle with whatever small opportunities still pass through your reach. The atmosphere around you has shifted into something noticeably softer, as if the entire market is beginning to loosen its grip on the day. Movement still exists, but it is no longer dense or competitive. Instead, it feels spaced out, like individual threads slowly separating from a woven cloth. You remain beside your final few items, which now feel almost delicate in their scarcity. The cloth beneath them is more visible than the goods themselves. What was once a display of livelihood has become a quiet reminder of what the day has already produced. A well-documented observation in medieval urban history is that many European towns structured their daily trade cycles around natural light patterns, with commercial intensity rising after sunrise and tapering significantly as daylight weakened. Long before formal timekeeping became widespread, you can feel that tapering now, not as a rule, but as a lived experience. Fewer people stop. Those who do move more slowly, not out of hesitation alone, but because the entire environment encourages winding down rather than engagement. You adjust your stance slightly, maintaining presence without forcing attention. A customer approaches and looks at your remaining goods with a kind of final curiosity, as if checking what is still available rather than actively seeking something specific. You greet them gently and allow silence to form naturally. That silence is different now. Earlier in the day, silence felt like uncertainty waiting to be resolved. Now it feels like completion taking shape. They select one item. The exchange is brief, almost understated. You accept the coins and store them carefully, noticing how each transaction now feels like a closing note rather than a step forward. A subtle but interesting detail from historical trade research suggests that late-day exchanges in medieval markets often required less verbal negotiation, as both buyers and sellers increasingly prioritized efficiency over bargaining once the likelihood of additional opportunities diminished. You experience this shift directly in the simplicity of each remaining interaction. Nearby, a vendor folds their display cloth with slow precision. Another begins stacking crates in preparation for departure. The sounds of packing now compete more with conversation than sales calls. You adjust your remaining goods again, though there is very little to arrange. The act is now more about maintaining structure than presenting abundance. Each item stands more isolated than before. A quirky observation drawn from ethnographic interpretations of pre-modern marketplaces suggests that many vendors developed an intuitive awareness of closing signals, such as reduced foot traffic, increased directional walking away from stalls, and the fading of browsing behavior that marked the transition from trade to departure. You are now fully immersed in that stage of the day. A small group passes nearby, speaking in low tones. Their conversation is more cohesive than earlier, fragmented chatter, but it is oriented away from commerce. You catch fragments about home, food, and rest. They do not stop. You complete another small sale shortly after. The exchange is simple and unhurried. Coins feel fewer in accumulation but heavier in meaning, as if each one represents the shrinking window of opportunity left in the day. A scholarly discussion in medieval economic studies often focuses on whether market decline was primarily a result of external daily rhythms, such as labour cycles and daylight, or whether it was reinforced by collective behavioural withdrawal, where participants unconsciously reduced engagement in anticipation of closure. In practice, both dynamics appear intertwined. You can sense both influences clearly now. Demand is diminishing, but so is participation intensity from all sides of the market. You shift your weight slightly, easing tension in your legs. Fatigue is no longer building quickly. It is simply present, steady and consistent, woven into every movement. A passerby glances at your remaining goods but continues walking. You do not attempt to call out. Energy is now conserved more than spent. A lesser-known historical note from municipal records suggests that some medieval markets experienced a final drift phase, where the rate of closure accelerated not because of formal signals, but because each individual decision to pack up encouraged others nearby to do the same, creating a cascading reduction in active trade space. That drift is clearly visible now. More stalls are partially dismantled. Cloth coverings are folded. Wooden frames are being loosened. The market is no longer expanding or contracting. It is emptying. You sell another item. The exchange is quick and efficient. There is no hesitation on either side. The sunlight is lowered further, shifting into a soft angle that stretches shadows across the stone ground. The environment feels less defined than earlier, as if edges are beginning to blur in preparation for transition. You gather your remaining goods closer together. There is almost nothing left to manage now, but the act itself maintains a sense of order. A quirky tidbit from reconstructed urban studies suggests that late-stage vendors often entered a mental state described as quiet accounting awareness, where attention shifted from attracting buyers to mentally preparing for end-of-day calculation, storage, and return travel. You are now operating fully within that phase of awareness. The market around you continues to thin. Movement is still present, but increasingly directional, oriented toward departure rather than engagement. You remain standing in place, observing the final patterns of activity, adapting less now to opportunity and more to closure as the day gently begins its final descent. The market feels different again, not quieter in a sudden way, but in a way that is steadily becoming undeniable. It is as if the space itself has started to loosen its structure, allowing people to drift out in uneven waves. Some stalls are already half dismantled, while others still cling to the last traces of trade. You remain with only a small handful of goods. At this point, each item feels less like inventory and more like a final decision waiting to happen. The cloth beneath them is nearly bare, and that visual emptiness subtly changes how others perceive your presence in the flow of the market. A well-established historical fact is that medieval marketplaces were often deeply tied to daylight cycles, meaning that as the sun descended towards the horizon, economic activity naturally declined without the need for formal closure announcements. The end of trading was something felt collectively rather than declared. You notice this collective feeling now. Fewer people are stopping. Those who do are moving with a sense of completion rather than curiosity. You adjust your posture slightly, staying open but no longer actively projecting urgency. A customer approaches slowly and looks at your remaining items. Their gaze lingers briefly, not searching for variety, but confirming what is still available. You greet them in a calm tone, allowing space for decision without interruption. Silence settles between you for a moment. It feels longer than earlier in the day, not because time has changed, but because the pace of interaction has slowed. They choose one item. The exchange is simple and final in tone. You accept the coins and store them carefully, noticing how each remaining sale now carries a stronger sense of closure than accumulation. A subtle but interesting detail from historical market research suggests that late-stage trading often involved minimal verbal exchange, as both buyers and sellers unconsciously reduced negotiation effort once the perceived value of further comparison decreased. You experience this reduction in language clearly now. Nearby, another vendor begins wrapping their stall with methodical care. Cloth is folded, goods are gathered, and wooden supports are loosened. The sound of packing now appears more frequently than the sound of selling. You adjust your remaining goods once again, though there is little left to arrange. The act feels more like maintaining dignity in presentation than optimizing visibility. A quirky observation from anthropological interpretations of medieval commerce suggests that many vendors developed an internal sense of end timing, allowing them to anticipate closure based on subtle environmental cues such as declining foot traffic, reduced bargaining, and increased directional movement toward exits. You're now fully immersed in that phase of awareness. A small group passes nearby, speaking softly. Their conversation is no longer about choosing or buying, but about returning, resting, and completing their own tasks. They do not stop. You complete another small sale shortly after. The exchange is quick and quiet. Coins feel fewer, but each one now carries the weight of diminishing opportunity. A scholarly debate in medieval economic history concerns whether end-of-day market decline should be understood primarily as a reflection of human biological rhythms tied to daylight or as a coordinated social behavior pattern where participants collectively reduce engagement in anticipation of closure. In reality, both interpretations seem to overlap in lived experience. You can feel that overlap now. The crowd is thinning, but not collapsing. It is dispersing in organized fragments, as though each person has reached their personal conclusion at slightly different times. You shift your stance slightly, easing tiredness in your legs. Fatigue is now consistent rather than escalating. It has become part of your baseline condition for the remainder of the day. A passerby briefly glances at your goods and continues walking without pause. You do not attempt to call them back. Effort now feels better reserved for likely interactions rather than uncertain ones. A lesser-known historical note from municipal records suggests that some medieval markets entered a final phase of accelerated closure where the act of one vendor beginning to pack could trigger a nearby chain reaction, gradually transforming active trade zones into empty corridors within a short period of time. You're beginning to see that cascade more clearly. More stalls are partially dismantled. More vendors are transitioning from selling to packing. The visual density of the market is visibly decreasing. You complete another exchange. The transaction is smooth and unhurried. There is no negotiation, only acceptance. The sunlight now has a softer quality, lower in burn or in angle and warmer in tone. Shadows stretch longer across the ground, marking the transition toward evening without any abrupt change. You gather your remaining goods closer together. There is almost nothing left to manage, but the act maintains structure in a space that is gradually losing its commercial identity. A quirky tidbit from reconstructed urban studies suggests that late medieval vendors often entered a reflective state during final trading hours, where attention shifted from economic engagement to mental preparation for departure, counting earnings, and anticipating the journey home. You are now fully within that mental transition. Around you, the market continues to dissolve in layers. Movement is still present, but increasingly oriented outward. The day is no longer expanding, it is winding down, and you remain there, quietly observing, adapting less to opportunity and more to conclusion, as the final active moments of trade slowly give way to the approaching end of the day. The market no longer feels like a place of gathering, it feels like a place in retreat. You can sense it in the spacing between people, in the way conversations are shorter, and in how movement is now directed almost entirely outward rather than inward. The energy that once pulled people deeper into stalls has faded into something lighter and more transient. You remain with only a few final items on your cloth. Each one now feels like a last possibility rather than part of a selection. The emptiness around them is no longer just physical space. It has become part of the presentation itself, shaping how others perceive what is left. A widely recognized historical fact is that medieval marketplaces were typically structured around daylight dependence, meaning that as natural light diminished, both vendor activity and customer engagement declined in tandem, gradually transforming the market from a commercial hub into a dispersing crowd. You're now clearly inside that transformation. Fewer people pass your position. Those who do are no longer browsing in any real sense. They are moving with purpose, often angled toward exits or gathering points outside the market area. You adjust your stance slightly, maintaining visibility without forcing attention. A customer approaches and pauses longer than most. Their gaze moves slowly across your remaining goods. You greet them softly, allowing silence to sit comfortably between you. That silence now feels different from earlier in the day. It is no longer filled with uncertainty or negotiation. It feels like the space where decisions are being finalized. They select one item. The exchange is brief and unadorned. You accept the coins and store them carefully, noticing how each remaining transaction now feels less like participation in trade and more like closing a chapter. A subtle but interesting detail from historical market studies suggests that late-stage trading behavior often showed a marked reduction in comparison shopping, as both buyers and sellers increasingly operated under a mindset of completion rather than optimization. You see this clearly in how quickly decisions are now made. Nearby, another vendor is already dismantling part of their stall. Cloth is being folded with slow precision. Wooden supports are being loosened. The sound of packing has become more common than the sound of bargaining. You adjust your remaining goods again, though there is very little left to organize. The arrangement is now about presence rather than abundance. Each item stands alone in a small space of attention. A quirky observation from ethnographic interpretations of medieval commerce suggests that many vendors developed an instinctive awareness of market closure cues, such as diminishing crowd density, increased directional walking patterns, and the gradual disappearance of browsing behavior. You're now fully operating within that perceptual stage. A small group passes nearby speaking quietly. Their tone is subdued, oriented toward a return rather than engagement. You catch fragments about home, food, and rest, but no one stops. You complete another small sale shortly after. The exchange is simple, almost automatic. Coins are fewer now, but each one carries increased significance due to scarcity of remaining opportunity. A scholarly debate in medieval economic history concerns whether the end of market activity should be understood primarily as a natural response to diminishing daylight or as a socially reinforced pattern where participants collectively accelerate withdrawal once a critical threshold of disengagement is reached. In practice, both forces appear to operate together. You can feel that convergence clearly now. The crowd is thinning, but also reorganizing itself into departure flow. People are not simply leaving individually, they are leaving in a shared directionality. You shift your weight slightly, easing fatigue in your legs. The tiredness is now steady, not rising or falling, just present as part of your body's baseline state. A passerby briefly glances at your remaining goods and continues without stopping. You do not attempt to call out. At this stage of the day, effort is reserved for the most likely opportunities. A lesser-known historical note from municipal observations suggests that some medieval markets entered a final accelerated closure phase where once a sufficient number of vendors began packing, the entire market space transitioned rapidly into an end state, with remaining activity dissolving in a cascading sequence. That cascade is now clearly visible. More stalls are partially dismantled. More vendors are transitioning from selling to packing, The visual identity of the market is changing quickly from active commerce to dispersal. You complete another exchange. The transaction is quiet and efficient. No hesitation remains on either side. The sunlight is now noticeably softer, angled lower across the street. Shadows stretch long and uneven, marking the progression toward evening. The space feels less dense, more open, and increasingly transitional. You gather your remaining goods closer together. There is almost nothing left. But the act itself preserves a sense of order as the environment continues to change. A quirky tidbit from reconstructed urban studies suggests that late medieval vendors often experienced a shift in attention during final trading hours, where focus moved away from attracting customers toward internal preparation for closure, accounting, and the physical process of leaving the market space. You're now fully within that transition. The market continues to loosen around you. Movement is still present, but increasingly directional, oriented away from trade and toward departure. The day is no longer expanding into possibility. It is contracting into conclusion, and you remain there, quietly observing, adapting less to opportunity and more to ending, as the final active structure of the market continues to dissolve around you. The market is now in its final living phase, where activity still exists but feels increasingly optional, as if everyone present has already begun to mentally leave, even while their bodies remain in motion. You can sense it in the spacing between footsteps, in the quieter tone of voices, and in the way stalls are no longer being actively defended with calls or gestures. You stand beside what remains of your goods, which now form a small, simple arrangement on the cloth. The emptiness around them is no longer just visual. It feels like space that is preparing to be reclaimed by the end of the day. Every item left carries a heightened sense of importance simply because there are so few of them. A well-established historical fact is that many medieval towns structured their commercial life around predictable daylight arcs, meaning that as afternoon progressed into evening, trade naturally declined due to both reduced visibility and the return of households to domestic routines. You can feel that arc reaching its final slope now. Fewer people pass in front of you. Those who do are not browsing. They are moving with clear intention toward leaving the market entirely. You adjust your stance slightly, but there is no longer need for active presentation. Visibility is becoming less relevant than completion. A customer approaches and briefly slows. Their attention is minimal but direct. You greet them softly, matching the subdued tone of the environment. They look at your remaining items without comparison or hesitation. The decision is almost immediate. One item is chosen, the exchange is completed quickly, with little spoken language between you. Coins are placed into your hand. You store them carefully. At this stage, each transaction feels less like accumulation and more like final accounting. A subtle but interesting detail from historical market analysis suggests that late-stage trading behavior in medieval environments often involved a marked reduction in deliberation time. As both buyers and sellers subconsciously prioritize closure over evaluation, you are now fully operating within that pattern. Nearby, more vendors are dismantling their setups. Cloths are folded, containers are closed. Wooden structures are loosened and prepared for transport. The sound of packing now outweighs the sound of selling. You adjust your remaining goods once again, though there is very little left to arrange. The act is no longer about presentation. It is about maintaining a sense of order while the environment dissolves around you. A quirky observation drawn from ethnographic interpretations of historical marketplaces suggests that many vendors developed a distinct end-of-day awareness, where sensory attention shifted away from attracting new customers and toward tracking environmental cues such as declining crowd density, directional movement toward exits, and the increasing presence of packing activity. You are fully inside that awareness now. You no longer scan for opportunity in the same way. Instead, you observe the final movements of the market as it winds down. A small group passes nearby, speaking in quiet tones. Their conversation is no longer centered on trade or browsing, but on returning home and concluding their day's tasks. They do not stop. Their movement is part of a larger collective drift outward. You complete another small sale shortly after. The exchange is simple and efficient. There is no negotiation, no hesitation, only completion. A scholarly debate in medieval economic history concerns whether the final phase of market decline should be understood primarily as a natural consequence of diminishing daylight or as a socially reinforced pattern where participants collectively reduce engagement once a threshold of reduced activity is reached. In lived experience, both processes appear to reinforce one another. You can clearly feel that reinforcement now. The market is not ending through a single cause. It is ending through accumulation of small decisions made in the same direction. You shift your weight slightly. Fatigue is steady in your legs and shoulders, no longer fluctuating. It has become part of your baseline state for the remainder of the day. A passerby briefly glances at your remaining goods but continues walking. You do not call out. Effort is now reserved for only the most certain interaction. A lesser-known historical note from municipal records suggests that some medieval markets entered a final cascade phase where once enough vendors began packing, the entire space transitioned rapidly into closure behavior, with remaining trade dissolving in a chain reaction of simultaneous withdrawal. That cascade is now unmistakable. Stalls are being dismantled across the area. Movement is increasingly directed outward. The visual identity of the market is shifting from commerce to departure. You complete another exchange. The transaction is quick, almost mechanical in its simplicity. Coins feel fewer, but more final in meaning. The sunlight has lowered further. The tone of the environment is warmer but dimmer, with longer shadows stretching across the stone surface. The sense of transition toward evening is no longer subtle. It is fully present. You gather your remaining goods closer together. There is almost nothing left, but the act maintains structure as everything else around you begins to dissolve into departure. A quirky tidbit from reconstructed urban studies suggests that late medieval vendors often entered a final reflective phase during closing hours, where attention shifted from engagement with buyers to internal preparation for departure, including mental accounting, emotional decompression, and readiness for the journey home. You are now fully within that final reflective phase. The market continues to empty around you in layered motion. People leave in small groups and individual paths, but all directions now lead outward rather than inward, and you remain there, holding what is left, observing the final thinning of activity as the marketplace slowly transforms from a place of exchange into a place of departure. The market is now in its quietest living state, where it no longer feels like a place of commerce, but more like a place remembering what it was only moments ago. The energy that filled it earlier has not disappeared suddenly. Instead, it has drained away in layers, leaving behind scattered movement and the sound of gradual departure. You stand with only the smallest remainder of your goods. At this point, they feel less like items for sale, and more like symbols of the day itself. The cloth beneath them is nearly empty, and that emptiness feels louder than the remaining objects. It is the kind of silence that is still filled with echoes of what just happened. A widely accepted historical fact is that medieval marketplaces typically dissolved in stages, rather than ending abruptly, with vendors packing gradually as daylight faded, and customers naturally dispersed toward residential areas and surrounding roads. You are witnessing that dissolution in real time now, not as a concept but as lived experience. Fewer people remain in your immediate area. Those who do are no longer participating in trade. They are preparing to leave, carrying goods, adjusting belongings, or simply walking with the quiet satisfaction of a completed day. You no longer adjust your posture for attention. Instead, you begin to prepare internally for your own departure. A final customer approaches, slower than most. Their presence feels less like part of the market and more like part of its ending. They look at your remaining items without urgency or comparison. You greet them softly, with a tone that matches the fading environment. They choose one final item. The exchange is simple, almost ceremonial in its quietness. You receive the coins and store them carefully. There is no negotiation, no hesitation, only completion. A subtle but interesting detail from historical economic interpretations suggests that late-stage market exchanges often reflected a psychological shift in both buyer and seller toward closure behavior, where the goal was no longer optimization but resolution. You feel that shift fully in this final transaction. Around you, the sound of packing dominates now. Cloths are folded, crates are closed, and wooden frames are dismantled. The physical structure of the market is being undone piece by piece. You begin packing your own remaining goods. There is very little left to organize, but the act is steady and deliberate. Each movement feels like closing a chapter rather than managing inventory. The cloth is folded carefully, not because it must be perfect, but because it marks the end of use for the day. A quirky observation drawn from ethnographic reconstructions of pre-modern trade spaces suggests that vendors often experienced a distinct cognitive transition during closing hours, where attention shifted from external engagement to internal reflection, accounting and preparation for return journeys. You are now fully inside that transition. The market around you continues to empty. Movement is now directional rather than exploratory. People are leaving in stream that converge toward exits and homeward paths. The sense of density that defined earlier hours is gone. You lift your bundle, now like Coca-Cola compared to earlier in the day, though your body feels heavier from accumulated effort. Fatigue is present, but it is steady and manageable, like a quiet weight that has been accepted rather than resisted. A scholarly debate in medieval economic history concerns whether the closure of markets was primarily dictated by environmental constraints such as daylight or whether it was reinforced by coordinated human behavior, where participants collectively transitioned out of activity once a critical mass of departure began. In practice, both forces appear inseparable. You step away from your selling position for the final time. There is no crowd left to face, no calls to make, no adjustments to consider. Only the path back remains. A lesser-known historical note from municipal observations suggests that some medieval markets experienced a final dispersal phase, where the last remaining vendors would leave in staggered intervals, creating a slow fading of presence rather than a single moment of closure. You join that dispersal. The streets outside the market feel different now, less compressed, more open. The sound of trade has been replaced by the quieter rhythm of return. Footsteps are spaced further apart. Conversations are softer and more personal. You walk through the same spaces that felt dense earlier in the day, now carrying only your remaining coins and empty bundle. The city is shifting back into its evening identity, one that belongs more to households than to commerce. A quirky tidbit from reconstructed urban studies suggests that vendors often experienced a gradual emotional easing during the walk away from markets, as the constant demand for attention, negotiation, and awareness slowly released its hold on their focus. You feel that easing now. The sun is lower, casting long light across the stone streets. Shadows stretch and soften. The air is cooler than it was during midday, carrying the first hint of evening calm. Behind you, the market continues to dissolve into quiet. Ahead of you, the path home becomes more defined with every step. And as you walk away from the place where your day was spent in constant adjustment and attention, you carry only what remains, what was earned, and what will be needed for tomorrow. The market does not follow you. It stays behind, slowly emptying, slowly settling, until it becomes just another quiet space in the city again, and you continue forward into the evening. Sweet dreams.